Welcome, everyone. This is our watercolor session, our intro to watercolor part two. And I am Ruth. We did a couple months ago, we did an intro to watercolor one. And I do want to say, if you didn't do that one, that's okay. We're going to be talking about some different things. But if you are brand new to watercolor or you need a little refresher, we do have some videos on YouTube that I would definitely recommend. In our first intro to watercolor, we talked a little bit about different types of supplies. We talked a little bit about color theory and blending colors, and we talked about techniques. Those three videos I would definitely recommend taking a look at. We spent the last half of that intro to watercolor series focusing on painting landscapes. Now in this session, this series, we're going to start off by focusing on abstract watercolor painting, which is my favorite. We'll get into abstract in just a moment, but we're going to start with abstract, and we're going to end our series by focusing on painting a still life. So we're going to cover a few different types of watercolor painting styles, right? Processes. So we're going to start off with abstract. Now, before we kind of jump in abstract, there are a couple things that I want to mention. That first reminder is all about different supplies, watercolor supplies. Now, I'm not saying you have to have these supplies in order to paint with watercolor. These are just some of the different supplies that are out there. Now, the supplies that I'm going to be using, and I'll move that out of the way. The supplies that I'm going to be using today, I'm going to demo with both a pan palette, which is a watercolor palette that already has pigment in it. And this is one you can get from like the dollar store or Walmart or someplace like that already has the colors in there. And then the other palette that I'll be demoing with is a palette where I used tube watercolors and I put those in my palette. So I've got two different palettes that I'm working with, and I'll be demoing with both of them just to help illustrate that whatever supply you have will work for this process, right? So I'm going to be going back and forth between those two. I'm also going to be using two different types of paint brushes. So I'm going to start off, I have a round brush and a flat brush. These are ones that I got just from Blick. They're specific to watercolor, right? So these are the two that I'm going to be using. This one is a size 8 and a size 13, right? So I'm going to be using those. I'm also going to be jumping between the watercolor brushes that came in pan palettes, which are a round brush and a flat brush as well. So if you get a pan palette, you're going to get one of these type of brushes in it. And so I'll be kind of jumping between all of them. And again, that's to illustrate that whatever supply you have will work for this process, right? For watercolor. You can have a nice watercolor with whatever supply you have. So I'm using two different types of palettes and a couple different types of brushes. I'm also using watercolor paper today. And as a reminder, watercolor paper, when we're using watercolor, we need a paper that's kind of thick and sturdy because we're using water with it. And so it needs to be able to hold up well to the water, right? And so the thicker the paper, the better it is for watercolor. Watercolor paper is ideal, but you can also use a mixed media paper, which is pretty sturdy as well. So I've got watercolor paper today. The next supply is 2 cups of water. The reason we have 2 cups of water is one will be clean water that we can add to our palette, and the other is to clean our brush. We don't want to add dirty water to the palette, right? So that's why we have those 2 cups of water. And then I also have a little rag or paper towel, and this is to help clean my brush in between colors as well. So again, the supplies that I'm using are my paints, my pigments, my paint palettes. I have a couple watercolor brushes. I have my watercolor paper. I have 2 cups of water, one for cleaning my brush and one for adding water to the palettes. And then I have a little rag or paper towel to help clean my brush. So those are the supplies that I'm going to be using today. as I said, we're going to start our series focusing on abstract watercolor painting. And as I shared earlier, this is my favorite way to use watercolor, abstract painting. Abstract watercolor painting is a way of painting that's based on general shapes and marks and patterns rather than a real representation of things. Right. So what that means is we're going to be making shapes and color marks instead of trying to paint a natural looking tree or a realistic face. Right. I think abstract watercolor, it does involve a little play, kind of pushing paint around, letting water do the work for us. I love doing abstract paintings with watercolor because it feels good to me. I'm not focused on making the right mark. I'm literally just pushing paint around. And I think when you're doing these abstract paintings with watercolor, it can be a very mindful and meditative painting process. And so what I mean by that is that mindfulness is a thread that kind of runs through a lot of our programming at Mather. And mindfulness is all about just being present in the making, being aware of the here and now and aware of what's right in front of you, not focused on anything else, to-do lists, what ifs, anything like that, but it's being focused on what's right in front of you. And I think watercolor is a wonderful way to kind of put us in that moment, really paying attention to what's right in front of us. And I think just making in general does that for sure. But watercolor specifically, it has a wonderful way of slowing us down. Right? Because we are literally waiting for paint to dry. We're literally waiting for the water to dry. So watercolor is not a fast process. And as we'll see as we kind of go through our sessions, abstract watercolor is a slow process, right? But it can be a really fun process for sure. All right, so today we're going to talk about, or as we go through these first few sessions on abstract, we'll talk about different techniques that are helpful in abstract painting. But what you'll see is that abstract painting can be anything, which is really great and freeing. It doesn't have to be a certain way. We're going to talk about different tips and techniques that will be helpful, that will set us up for success. But the truth is that you can follow these tips and tricks and have a successful painting, but you can also ignore them completely and still have a successful painting. So take what is helpful, use it, and know that it is totally okay to ignore the rest. Okay, so our focus for today specifically, we're going to focus on two different techniques. We're going to focus on a flat wash. We're going to focus on glazing. Now, if you weren't with us for intro to watercolor, that's okay. We're going to kind of walk through it together. We're also going to spend a little time today talking about color combinations, and hopefully we'll get a little time to talk about composition as well. But I have some cards here, and I just want to show really quickly. These are the two techniques that we're going to be looking at today. A flat wash, which is a flat wash of color. It is the same all the way across, right? There's no variation in color. It's just a flat wash of color. And this is done by painting wet on dry. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, wet on dry is a wet brush on dry paper. Next week, we're going to spend some time wet on wet, so we'll talk more about that later. But we're going to focus today on a flat wash, which is a wet on dry, a wet brush on dry paper. The second technique that we're going to be looking at is glazing. And glazing is all about using those flat washes of color, waiting for that layer to dry, and then painting another flat wash on top of it. So we can see I have several layers here of that same color. You can see it building up. I did my first layer, and when it dried, I did my second layer. And then when that dried, I did my third layer. Right, so glazing is about layering up each flat wash once it dries, right? And so those are the two that we're going to be kind of looking at today. Before we get into practicing those, to actually making those, I want to talk a little bit about color combinations. So when we start an abstract painting, when you start any type of painting, it's always good to think a little bit about your color choices. It can help, the colors that you choose can help set your painting up for success, right? There is an artist that I absolutely love his work. His name is Vasily Kandinsky. You may have heard his name before. If you've been in other groups with me, you probably heard me bring him up. He was an abstract expressionist painter. And so what that means is that he painted these abstract paintings, but he believed that colors and the marks that you make can express feelings, they can express emotion, and they can have meaning. And I tend to believe him, believe that kind of the same thing. I think the colors that we choose can convey a message, right? Whether it's just we like using a certain color, and we use that in a lot of our paintings, our drawings, or, you know, maybe we're feeling just like yellow today, or maybe we're feeling blue. But you may notice that you are drawn to certain colors. I know I am. There are certain colors that make me feel good, and there are certain colors that I stay away from. Right? And so one thing to kind of keep in mind is our color choice, right? And so here on this handout, the color theory handout, you'll see there's a little color wheel here. You may be familiar with the color wheel, but I think it's a good refresher to have. I want to talk about a couple different color combinations to kind of get us thinking in that direction, right? In our color wheel, you'll see different colors kind of laid out. We have our primary colors, which are the red, the yellow, and the blue. And we have our secondary colors, which are the orange, the green, and the purple. And then we have the tertiary colors, which are the red, orange, yellow, green. It's all those other colors that are added in there. But what I want to kind of start focusing on is different ways we can combine those colors to really express, right? So the first one I want to talk about is complementary colors. And so complementary colors are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So for example, a complementary color of red is going to be green. It's right across from it on the color wheel. Now, complementary color is one that you can use, these colors that you can use together. They make each other more vibrant, more bright, more bold. A great example of an artist who used complementary colors quite often, very successfully, was Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. And I'm sure we can think of some of his paintings. He was a master at using complementary colors, and his paintings are really bold and vibrant. Those colors really shine bright in his paintings, right? And he utilized those complementary colors to get that effect. So one thing you can use in your abstract painting is to think about complementary colors. If you want your painting to be really bold and vibrant, that's one way to get that in your color choices, using those complementary colors. Another great combination that is really nice to use are the analogous colors. And the analogous colors are colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. It can be 2 colors, it can be 6 colors. There's no limit to what color that can be, how many that can be. But an example of that would be the red, orange, orange, and orange, yellow. Those are the analogous colors, right? Another example would be the red, red, violet, and violet. These are right next to each other on the color wheel. And so there's something that can feel really soothing about those colors when we put them together. So that's another thing to think about, right? Those analogous colors, making a painting that feels soothing. Maybe that's not what we want. Maybe we want something that is more energetic than we want something that's calming, right? Either way is good. But it's helpful to think about what colors you're wanting to choose to create your painting, right? Because those colors will have an effect. They will. I'm going to start off by talking about those techniques. We're going to go back to the flat wash and to the glazing. And so I'm going to kind of put these here so we can kind of see them as we're going along. And I'm going to start off by using my flat brush. I'm going to use a round brush. But no, whatever brush you use, whatever palette you use is good, right? You'll get a successful painting. Today, we're going to kind of play around with it and not focus on actually painting something, but just trying out a couple techniques that are helpful in abstract painting. Now, before we start painting, a good first step is always to activate our colors. And we activate our colors in our palette by simply adding water to them. And again, the reason we do that is once the water kind of sits with that pigment a little bit, it loosens it up, so you get a more bold color. You don't get something that's kind of loose or light. So I have a little spray bottle that I'm just going to kind of spray on my watercolor palette. You can use a spray bottle if you want, or you can just take a dropper and add water that way, or you can take your paintbrush and just add water gradually that way. It doesn't matter how you add water to it, but it is helpful to start activating that palette. Now we're going to let that sit just a moment, and while that's sitting, I want to talk about mixing colors a little bit. You can use the colors directly from your palette. There's nothing wrong with that. And you can also mix colors. So in your color palette, if you have a pan palette that you bought that already has color in it, if you look on the lid, there's generally a couple sections on the lid. You can use that tray to mix colors. If you have a palette where you're adding tube watercolors to it, you'll see that there are also sections on the palette that you can use for mixing colors. So there are a couple places that come with your palette, regardless of the type of palette you have. Another thing to kind of have on hand, if you like mixing colors, is an extra tray. So I have this tray. You can see I use it a lot. It's pretty stained. But I have a tray here that I use to mix colors. And I use this often to mix colors. But you can also get a palette for mixing that has sections in it. Some people like this more because it keeps your colors separated. So it's good to kind of have that on hand if you want to do some mixing. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in a minute. We're going to talk about flat wash. We're going to kind of practice that a little bit. Now, a flat wash is just a flat wash of color. It's your wet brush on a dry paper. Now, we don't want a whole lot of water on our brush, right? We don't want that pigment to pool, right? We just want a flat wash of color. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush wet. And I'm just going to kind of tap it a little bit. I don't want a whole lot of water on my brush. But I want enough to be able to move the pigment from my palette to my paper. So I'm going to use a light green that's from my pan palette. I'm just going to kind of get my pigment on my brush, right? And you can see I have quite a bit of pigment on my brush here. When we're doing a flat wash, we don't want a whole lot of water. So you want to make sure that you're either tapping it or scraping the pigment on the side of your palette just to get a lot of that water off. And then doing a flat wash is simply just kind of making that mark, right? So if you have your paintbrush with you, if you have your paint palette, just go ahead and practice that for a second. Try that out. It's not using a whole lot of water. And if you haven't done a flat wash before, it takes a minute to get used to it, right? Get used to how much water to use, right? How much pigment to use. And you can see that I've got a flat wash here. There's no pooling. There's not a lot of extra water there, but it is a flat wash of color. So I'm going to do it again, get my brush wet and just kind of tap it a little bit. And I'm going to do the same color. Just kind of load my brush up with a pigment. I'm going to do just a little scraping so I don't have a whole lot. And again, I'm just going to kind of do some brushing here. Right? Again, this is a flat wash. We don't want a huge variation in color, right? We just want a wash of color here. Right? So I just kind of practice that again. You see I'm using the same color. And I'm going back and again, just getting my wet brush, dipping it in the pigment, scraping off some of that extra water. Just kind of creating a shape, practicing that flat wash. And again, you can see I'm using 1 water cup to clean my brush, and then using 1 water cup to fill my brush with water so I can do my palette, go to my palette. And again, it may take a minute to kind of get used to how much water to put on your brush to create that flat wash. We're not wanting that pigment to pool, right? We're just wanting that flat wash of color. Now, glazing is a technique that happens a lot, that people use a lot in watercolor, especially abstract watercolor. And it's all about that layering. So if you're still doing different, testing out flat washes, definitely keep practicing that. We're going to come back to that in a minute. We're going to let the ones we've done dry a little bit. But there are different ways to do glazing, to use glazing. You can create different shapes and layer it up. You can create like even something that's sort of representational. You know, abstract art is not exactly non-objective, right? Abstract art can be taking something that is representational, like a landscape, and abstracting it a little bit. So it's not quite a landscape, but it gives the idea of a landscape. Now, example I have of that is this image here, right? Where it's not exactly a realistic landscape, right? We don't see blue mountains, blue hills, blue grass. But the way I have it layered up gives this feeling of landscape, right? So yeah, so it can give this kind of illusion, this feeling, like I said, of a landscape, even though it's not necessarily something that is a landscape room. So I have another example here, and this is what we're going to kind of try out today. You can see that this is several different flat washes layered on top of each other. I used complementary colors, greens and reds, and layered them up. And one of the things that you can notice is that you see the different layers under those colors. They're kind of built up. And you can see that over here too with my landscape. I just kind of layered those colors up. You can create a lot of depth, a lot of patterning, a lot of using the same colors or using different colors to kind of create a variety of images again. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on is this here. So if you are doing a certain color combination, excellent. If you are just picking whatever color is close to you, that's also excellent. But we're going to spend a moment just kind of working on a little painting, right? So I've got 4 washes of color. And because we've been doing flat washes, it dries pretty quickly. We don't use a whole lot of water. We have a mostly wet brush on dry paper. And that paper, because it's so thick, it absorbs that water pretty quickly. So we can paint on top of it. And so to start that glazing process, we have our marks, our pieces of color, faces of color. So I'm going to add another color on top of it to try that glazing process, right? Which again is layering. It's layering another flat wash on top of a dried flat wash. So I'm going to get my brush wet again, tap it a little bit. And I'm going to come over, I'm going to use the red from my palette here. And again, I'm getting it on my brush, a nice amount of pigment, but I don't want a whole lot of water. So I'm kind of scraping that off a little bit. And then coming over here, and I'm actually going to just kind of paint down. Okay, so I did a flat wash on top. I have my green underneath and that red on top. And so you can see how the color layers, right? And you can see watercolor is just naturally this translucent pigment, right? So you get to see all these wonderful layers show up. And so I think a lot of watercolor, especially abstract watercolor, it really is about playing and experimenting. And I think abstract watercolor, more than any other type of watercolor, is about the process. Even though I'm a big believer in process is more important than the end result, I think abstract watercolor is just a great example about how the process can be so much fun, regardless of how the end result turns out, for sure. So let's kind of practice that a little bit, doing some of that layering. And again, it's painting another layer, right, of a flat wash on top of a dried layer of flat wash. So I'm going to get my brush wet again. I'm going to come back to that red, load my brush up so I've got some nice color, scrape it so I'm not doing a whole lot of water. And then I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to do a little circle. And again, it's not a whole lot of water. We don't want any pooling, water pooling. We just want that kind of flat wash of color. Watercolor can also be very musical, the tapping. So this here, you can see, hopefully you can see the difference. And the way I painted here, that flat wash, right, is that smooth color change, right? Here, I have a lot of water, right? You can see it's starting to pool, which is not bad. It's just not the flat wash, and it makes it hard to do the glazing. So there's a little difference. You can kind of see that difference. That flat wash is drying with a smooth finish. That heavy, like a large amount of water, kind of gives that opportunity for pooling. And like I said, it's a little harder to do glazing when you have a whole lot of water like this. One of the things that you can do, though, is take a dry brush. If you do get too much water on there, take your dry brush and then just kind of lift it. This is also a technique that we talked about in our first watercolor series. But lifting is really helpful because it can pull off some of that extra water and it can pull off some of that extra pigment. And so you can see now that once I pulled that extra water up, I lifted it with my dry brush, I got a flat wash with it, right? So there's really no mistakes here. It's just kind of playing around with that process. And the more we layer up, the more we add to it, the more interesting, right, our painting gets. And again, if we're thinking about our color combinations, what kind of feeling are we expressing? Are we expressing a feeling? Or are we just kind of playing around with it? And the truth is, any way is okay, because when it comes to abstract art, whatever you do works, especially when it's your own work that you're making, and you're not making it for any specific purpose. I do a lot of abstract watercolor on my own because it feels good to do it. It feels good to just make the marks and fill the paper with color. So I'm going to kind of continue doing this. I want to encourage you to do that too. Filling up your brush with water, filling it with pigment, right? And then just kind of scraping it a little bit to get that extra water off. Kind of making those marks. And you can see I'm not just doing like flat washes that are squares or circles. You can do a flat wash in any mark that you make. Okay? Let's say I'm going to do it again, fill my brush up. Maybe I just want to kind of come across and do marks like that. It really is just about mark making, right? And so you can still see that even though I'm not doing the squares, I'm doing just brush strokes, you can still see that glazing happening, that layering on top. Right? these techniques, doing that flat wash and that glazing, are two techniques that are really helpful when it comes to abstract art, doing that plain wash of color and then being able to layer on top of it. If any questions come up, again, always feel free to email us at our contact@Mather email, or message us on our Facebook page. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Happy painting. We'll see you soon.